Hello everyone, and welcome to Python week number 4 by Akshat. So what's our agenda for today? First, I'm going to teach you guys how to utilize string libraries where we can manipulate strings to however we desire. Then we'll learn about loops, where we'll learn about while loops, and then for loops. So let's get into it. So the first thing we have to understand is, what is string manipulation? Well, strings are basically a collection of characters similar to list, and they can be manipulated in many ways. Some examples would be making all the characters lowercase, uppercase, or maybe even splicing a string. All of this is possible with the use of libraries, which are basically pieces of code that other people made, and we can access them through the use of libraries and change our own code in the process. So let's look at some examples. We imagine we have a variable named var and it's storing the string hello. If we wanted to lowercase all the characters, what we would do is print var, which is the variable's name, then do dot lower parentheses. The dot lower parentheses is a built-in Python library, and it would make all of the characters lowercase. Now let's say we want to uppercase all the characters. We would do the same process where it would be var dot, but in this case we would have dot upper, indicating that we want to make all of the characters uppercase. Now let's say we want to print a certain part of the string. Now this is called string splicing, and it's basically where we utilize our concept of list and apply that to strings. So strings are basically a collection of characters, which what I mean by that is they're a list of characters. So the first string being stored inside of hello would be H, the first character. The second character would be E. So how would we access this? Well, we would use var and then access the index 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, and so on. So that is how we would do it. Now let's say we want to access the variables var from the index 0 all the way to 1. How we would do this is var and the same braces that we use for list, and inside we would do 0:1. However, it's okay if you don't even put the 0, as Python by itself, by default, assumes that you're talking about from the beginning all the way to whatever index you wrote. In this case, we wrote 1, so understand that we have to print all the characters from the index 0 to 1. In this case, it will only print out the letter H. Now, what is the need for libraries? Well, we've only looked at some very basic libraries, and there are many more advanced and very helpful libraries that we'll later learn. They basically help expedite the development process in coding and allow for us to reuse existing libraries' functionalities so that we do less coding and don't need to brainstorm or spend as much time on certain portions of our code. Some libraries are already built in, provided by Python. However, there are others which are third-party and require us to download them, which is important to keep in mind. Now let's get on to loops. This is the main thing that we're learning in this video. So what are loops? Loops basically repeat the same line of code again and again and again. This is very beneficial if someone wants to modify the data for a large quantity that could have billions of data points. This is very applicable in companies and other places. So the first thing we have to understand are there are two different types of loops, for loop and then while loop. So let's get into it. So first we have to understand the syntax, and then we'll talk more in detail about what each of the loops do. So for a while loop, our syntax is that we first need a condition, such as I is always less than 8, or I is always greater than 8, whatever the case, right? So we'd first write our while, indicating that there's going to be a while loop, and we follow that with a conditional statement, similar to our if conditional statements that we learned 2 videos ago. If you haven't learned that, make sure to look back at that video and then come back here. So now we already declared I to be equal to 0. It's important that there should eventually be an end to this conditional statement, or else our code would crash, which is a very bad thing. So, and to indicate that this is inside of the loop, what we do is indent our code saying that it's inside of the while loop, and it would print hello world 8 times. And we make sure that our I value is incrementing every iteration by having it do I plus equals 1. Now let's look in for loop. So the for loop syntax is a bit different. So in this situation, we have a var, which is storing the string hello world. And what we do is for, indicating that this is going to be a for loop, and then some variable such as I or whatever placeholder variable that you want to use in, and then whatever large data type such as hello world or a list is going to be written there. So what this basically does is that each and every, let's think of how to phrase this. We'd access each and every index of this variable. So what this means is in the first iteration, we're going to have I equal to H. The second iteration, it's going to be I equals E. The third iteration, I equals L, and then so on. Why this works like that is basically it loops through our var and then accesses each and every index after every iteration. So now let's have a quick debrief on loops. These two loops are basically keep on repeating and have the same line of code. However, they achieve two very different goals. In the while loop, the code keeps on running as long as the conditional statement stays true. However, for the for loop, the code loops through the list of data, meaning that eventually by the end of the list data, the for loop will also stop working. So let's understand what is being printed in this while loop and what's being printed inside of this for loop. So pause the video and try to figure that out. Alright, so now let's talk about what's being printed. So first let's talk about our while loop. So this means that every iteration it's going to print a whole sentence saying hello world, meaning it'll say hello world 8 times. Now for the for loop, it would be for I in var, and what it basically do is print H, then E, then L, then L, then O, then space, then W, then O, and so on. So this is going to be a very different result compared to our while loop. Now let's do some practice. Utilizing a while loop, I want you guys to loop through a list of names and print each one out. So pause the video now and try to do this. Alright, so now let's start with our looping through a list of names. So the first thing we have to do is write down our syntax of while, then some conditional statement, and then colon. And inside of that we would print some item, which we'll figure out later. And then we have to make sure that we increment our I value, which is going to start off as I equals 0. So this is some of the basic syntax, and then we probably have to look at names. Now let's think about this. How would we loop through all of the names in the list called names? So what I'm probably thinking would be the best approach would be as long as I is less than the length of names, which I can basically use is a built-in library of Python, which is len, and then names. Alright, so this will basically give me the length of the list of names. And in this case, it would return 1, 2, 3, 4. So the length would be 4 because there's 4 items in the list. So as a result, it'll run 4 times. And what I want to print is each index of names. So what I would do is names, and then access the index of names, which would be the braces, and inside the index, which would be I. So now let's test this out if it works. As you can see, we get Jack, then Carl, then Howard, and finally Adam. And that's how you would do this. Now let's start doing some practice with for loops. So I want you guys to find the character I in the given string, which is I like in and out. And basically in the end, what I want you guys to do is print how many times it's said. Basically, how many times is the letter I said in this string? So pause the video right now and try to figure it out. So as you can see so far, we have a string which is I like in and out. So to make things easier for us, the first thing we should probably do is make a new variable called newString and basically use one of the inbuilt Python libraries that I was talking about earlier, which would be string.lower. This would basically make that letters like I would become lowercase, the I in, and more. So let's get started. So the first thing we have to do is loop through each and every character in this sentence. So how would we do this? Well, in this case, I think we have to use a for loop, and then we'll store it inside of a variable called I. So for I in, actually we'll do for character. We'll store inside of a variable called character. For character in string, which will basically mean that after every iteration, it'll store the next value, and yeah. So now we have to check, is character equal to the letter I? If it is, what we have to do is increase the value of counter. Now you might be wondering, what is counter? Well, what we're going to do is make another variable called counter equals 0, and it basically tracks how many times there is an I in the variable called new underscore string. My bad. It should be new underscore string rather than string. So that's how you do it. Counter plus equals 1. And then at the end, after it's done looping through the entire list, what we want to do is print counter. So let's run this. Alright, and we get 3. So now we'll just test this out and see if how many I's we see ourselves. So we got 1 I, 2 I, and then 3 I's. So that means that this is correct. Now let's test this out with another sentence, such as Los Angeles. So Los Angeles. Now let's run it. As you can see, we get 0 I's, and it means that it works. Alrighty, now for our final assignment, we're going to utilize loops yet again, and we're going to make a program that can tell the user whether a number is prime or composite. So pause the video and go check what a prime number is and what a composite is. It's important to understand what makes each and every prime number or composite number unique from each other. Alright, now we already have a number being stored inside of our variable called number. Now we have to understand how we can determine a number is prime or it's composite. So the first thing I'll do is make a Boolean variable called is prime. So by default, we're going to assume that it is prime. Now we have to run a certain piece of code to check whether or not the number is prime. So what is a prime number? A prime number is a number that is only divisible by the number itself and 1. So meaning if we can divide it by a number such as 2, 3, 4, and so on, it's going to become composite. So we have to check this conditional statement somehow. So the first thing we probably want to do is have a while loop that goes all the way up to the number itself. So while I is less than number. And we also have to declare I, and we should probably do it as 2, as that is the first number that we can divide it by and check whether or not it's composite. Now, inside of our while loop, we have to have a conditional statement where we have to check that the remainder is equal to 0, because that indicates that these two numbers are divisible, right? So we would do number percent, which is the modulus operator, percent I, and it has to equal 0. So well, if it equals 0, then it indicates that is prime is false, and that's how we would do it. Now, that is all we would do, or is it? We have to remember that every time we go through an iteration, we have to increment that I value, or in some way we have to end this conditional statement at a certain point of time. So how we would end this conditional statement would be while I is less than number, then it'll be 2, then 3, and then eventually it'll reach the value of number and the conditional statement stops working. So now, if is underscore prime is true, then we probably want to print number is prime. And if it isn't, which would be our else statement, we would print number is composite. Now let's test this out. So let's give a number such as 3, which we know is prime. As you can see, we get number is prime. Now let's try 10, which is composite. As you can see, our code works. And that's how you'd implement this. If you guys are still confused, put some comments down below and I'll be happy to answer them.